Welcome, everybody. So glad that you're joining us for this particular session. We're going to be talking about what we're learning about the use, how data is informing what we know about mobility mentoring. We're going to have two sessions today. The first one, David Phillips from the Lab for Economic Opportunities at Notre Dame is going to be talking about a really exciting randomized controlled trial, which he and his colleagues have been undertaking, looking at overall the impact of a mobility mentoring informed program in Rochester, New York. And so that'll give you a big picture, wonderful overview of the impact of mobility mentoring on outcomes for the populations that we care most about. After that presentation, and my name is Charlie Homer. I've met many of you. I work at EMPath as the Chief Improvement Officer. I'm going to be reviewing data that Tom Miller and I and others at EMPath have undertaken, and we're going to be sort of diving within the black box of mobility mentoring and looking at some of the components, and particularly the process of goal setting, and seeing how goal setting in particular relates to outcomes. So those are our two presentations today, and with no further ado, I'm going to pass it over to David.
Thank you so much. As he said, my name's David Phillips. I'm at the Lab for Economic Opportunities, or LEO, at the University of Notre Dame. I'm really excited to be with this group to talk about an evaluation we've been doing of Bridges to Success, which is a mobility mentoring inspired program in Rochester, New York, and is a situation, where our goal is to measure the overall impact of mobility mentoring on employment and other outcomes. First, I'm going to just give you the 2-minute version of sort of who I am and how I'm connected to this. So I'm an academic. I'm an economist at the University of Notre Dame. I'm part of this place called the Lab for Economic Opportunities, or LEO. And our goal really is that there are social service providers, like all of you, part of why I'm really excited to be talking with this group, right, who are doing innovative work all around the country to work on issues of poverty. And we really could know a lot more about what among those things are the most effective, so that we can do more of them. And so what we do at LEO is we partner with service providers to do evaluations that try to identify, okay, what's making the most difference in addressing poverty in the United States. So what do? We look around for innovators, and one of them, the group of folks we found in Rochester, New York. And we do some teaching around impact evaluation with our partners of like, okay, why might we want to do this particular kind of evaluation? We then try to overlay research design on anti-poverty programs, make these two things work together rather than work against each other, right? Which is a lot of the actual work of doing this. And then we try to learn, and we try to keep learning and improve and learn and improve. And when we find something that's making a huge difference, then be able to share that so that more and more people do things that are making a big difference. Right, the ultimate goal in the end is that there are people at the end of this process, right, and wanting to be able to do things and put resources toward what is making a big difference, and being able to draw support towards exciting, innovative work that makes a difference. And so this evaluation of Bridges to Success is one project that we've been working on, and it is a mobility mentoring type program inspired by mobility mentoring. I think you'll see it's quite similar, I would say, to what many of you are doing in other places around the country. This is a big collaboration. So the program itself is run by a number of organizations. So Catholic Family Center, Action for a Better Community, and early on in the process, Community Place in Greater Rochester, all have sort of collectively worked to implement this program. So it's a big group effort of many organizations in the nonprofit world in Rochester. The city of Rochester has also been a big supporter of this work and of the evaluation. And then the academic side of the team includes Javier Espinosa, who's a professor at Rochester Institute of Technology right in Rochester, and then our group at the Lab for Economic Opportunities. So what is Bridges to Success? So this is going to sound, right, in a 15-minute presentation, I'm not going to give you a whole lot of depth here, but what I'm going to tell you is going to sound very familiar, right? So it's going to be holistic and individualized and wraparound. So it's going to be, right, based off of a bridge tool, a bridge self-sufficiency tool that has multiple different domains. People are going to be setting their own goals, and there's going to be a mentor and a long-term relationship with that mentor that's going to help facilitate setting long-term goals, and then also setting more immediate goals to make it to those long-term goals. And right, the different potential areas are ones that would be familiar, things like employment and education and family support and housing and so on. It is connected to brain science in the way that empath-inspired interventions are, right? So there's this idea of taking very long-term goals and bringing them into very short, concrete ones. The program also has financial incentives that are sometimes tied to those specific, concrete, more immediate goals, steps along the way. It's also a quite intense program. So this is a program that lasts for about 2 years, and the vast majority of people who are in it actually do complete those 2 years. Working with a mentor, professional mentor, who has, as would be familiar, I think, in the programs that you all run, a much smaller caseload than people might be familiar with from like lots of public programs, TANF programs, this sort of thing, right? We have sort of gigantic caseloads and very like sort of light touch interventions, right? This is, think of a case manager who's working with 20 people or something like. So that's the model, which probably sounds familiar. And then the evaluation that we're going to be doing the goal is to just measure the overall impact of this. How much of a difference does it make if somebody gets Bridges to Success versus the status quo assistance that would be available in the community and with the assets that they have themselves? And so what we're going to do to try to measure that kind of difference is to compare people who are offered the chance to be in Bridges to Success and participate to a randomly selected control group of people, a comparison group who's going to get emergency services. So if they come in with an emergency, like I'm about to become homeless, like they'll get help with that, but they don't get this long 2-year program that sounds like mobility mentoring. And so by making that comparison, there's 2 important things there. One, we're going to compare. So we're going to try to measure impact. What would have happened to folks anyway, and what's the difference that this makes? What's the added value of mobility mentoring? Not just how do outcomes change, but what's the added value of this piece above and beyond other things that are available to the person or in the community. And the second piece is we make that comparison in a fair way by taking a group of people who are all interested in this program, but because of capacity constraints, everybody can't be enrolled in the program. So randomly selecting about half of them to be able to be in the program and but still collecting information about the other half so that we can learn what would have happened to people, a similar group of people, if they weren't able to access this program. What I'm going to show you in the presentation today is going to be, this evaluation is ongoing. I'm going to show you sort of incomplete results, talking about what's happening to people in the first cohort of this evaluation after 12 months. So for a very long-term program, right, that's not a complete story. And there's also more people who've enrolled in the evaluation since then that we don't have outcomes for yet. So this is incomplete, but it's going to be a first glance at, I think we're excited about. So I'm going to show you a few pictures that look something like this. So it's worth talking through. This is the sort of data that we're going to get from this experiment. So I'm showing you 2 different groups of people. So on the right here, you've got the Bridges to Success group. And I'm showing you employment rates. And this currently is at baseline. So this is at the point where people are signing up for the evaluation and they don't know which group they're going to get in yet. And so you can see that about 24% of people in the evaluation group, which at the data that we have now is about 130 people, about 24% of them are employed when they show up. So it's a very low employment rate. This is part of why you want to make this apples to apples comparison, right? We don't want to compare Bridges participants to sort of a general population. People show up for a reason, often because they're in crisis. And so employment rates are low when people show up. The comparison group has pretty similarly low employment rates, maybe a tick higher at 31%, but pretty similar. So the sort of random assignment here is doing what we would hope it would do, giving us a similar group. The real interesting thing is what happens to them later on. So 12 months later, we see people, and that's the gold bars here. And you're going to notice a couple of things when you look at those gold bars. The comparison I'm going to want you to make is between the 2 gold bars, right? So remember, this is an apples to apples comparison. These are similar groups. They started off in relatively similar situations. And it looks like now the Bridges to Success group has edged ahead, right? A little bit more than half, 56% of them are employed after 12 months, compared to 51% in the control group. So there's about a 5 percentage point increase for the Bridges to Success group. And if you wanted to push me on this, and I would agree with you that, well, the Bridges group started off maybe a little bit behind, and you wanted to tick that up and call that 10% to sort of make a count for starting off a little bit behind, I'd agree with you on that, and say that this is probably something closer to like 9 or 10 percentage points higher employment in the Bridges group due to the program. As I said, this evaluation is ongoing, so we can't sort of shout that result from the rooftops quite yet, because it's in technical language, it's not quite statistically significant yet. we're increasing the sample size and sort of precision to hopefully be able to make stronger statements about that later. But I think it is very encouraging, and it's pointing in the direction of, even after only 12 months, seeing some big differences in employment. So I think that's the big exciting thing that we get about this. One other thing you might get from this picture too is that it's important. Actually doing the randomized control trial, I think, is a useful and helpful thing, because we learned something new we wouldn't learn otherwise. Right, this is for a group of people, I didn't say the timeline before, right? This is a group of people who started enrolling in the program about 3 years ago. And so this was during more of an economic boom time in the current situation. And so you see everybody improving, right? You see folks who didn't get access to Bridges to Success also improving as well. And so here, if we just sort of look before and after, we might sort of overestimate the benefits of this program. Similarly though, right, if you ran an evaluation like this in the current context, and some of you may be running to this now, right, if you just do a before and after comparison of participants in your program, you might actually see them doing worse in the program, or you might see them just holding constant, but that might be success right now, given everything that's going on in the world. In the context of Rochester, New York, a couple of years ago, you know, the before and after was maybe an overestimate of the benefits of the program, but now that might be a different sort of thing. But at the end of the day, I think we're seeing very promising signs of increases in employment overall that hopefully we'll be able to sort of pin down more precisely in the future. The other result I want to talk about today is a little bit about who benefits. So one thing that has sort of strikingly come out to us from the 12-month data that we have so far of seeing people for a year is that it looks like people with different job prospects, at least in the short term, are benefiting differently from this program. So I'm going to split people into 3 different groups. The technical side of that I'm gonna hold back on unless people want to ask in the Q&A, because it would take more than the time we've got. But trust me that I'm going to split people based off the data into groups, 3 different groups based off of what their job prospects would be if they didn't have access to a program like this. And you can think of that lower group if you want as, for instance, like people who don't have a high school diploma or who don't have a job when they show up, who have greater challenges at finding and succeeding in the job market. And on the higher group, right, you're going to have people who have more advantages. They're going to be more likely to have a degree and training and prior work experience. And then there's going to be a middle group sort of in between those. So I'm going to split people into 3 different groups and see how much of a difference this Bridges to Success program makes for those 3 different groups of people. And so I'm going to show you the graph basically that I showed you before, but just for this lower group. So these are people who have the greatest challenges in the job market if they didn't get assistance. And for them, we're seeing dramatic improvements in employment, right? So compared to, right, so this is a group who about a third of them, 34% of them, would have a job 12 months after enrollment if they didn't have access to the program, compared to more than half, 55%, if they do have access to the program. This was really exciting to us, because this is saying for the group of people who struggles the most in the labor market, who has the greatest challenges, this type of program is having huge benefits for. And that passes all of it's statistically significant, all the sort of scientific things we'd like to be true. And so we're really confident that this is making a big difference for people who face really big challenges in the job market, which I think is exciting because we don't know about a lot of programs that do that. And so I think that's one really exciting thing for us. And then as you sort of go up the scale, you see this start to fade a little bit, right? In the middle group looks more like the average results, where we see some increases, but more sort of moderate in terms of increased employment for the middle group. And then if you compare those gold bars for the highest group, we're not seeing much signs of benefits in the highest group. And so this is at least one early indication that the Bridges to Success is making some bigger difference for people with greater challenges. It is worth pointing out that this is at 12 months. So it might be the case that the benefits for people who come in, who already have a job, who already have a high school diploma when they show up, but they have other barriers, right? It might take them longer for benefits to show up. So I don't think I would look at this at that high end group and say, oh, they're never going to benefit. I think we need to wait and see. But it shows at least after 12 months where we're seeing big benefits is for folks who have the greatest challenges. And this is really from another evaluation, but I think relates to that is there's a similar program in a lot of ways, maybe one step further removed from mobility mentoring in Fort Worth, Texas, that another group from the same lab I'm at is evaluating with a similar research design. And there they have a little bit more time on their side because they started before we did in Rochester. And one interesting thing they found is that they find a similar sort of, right, compare people in the program, which we call treatment in scientific language, to people not getting the program, right? They're similar at the start. The folks in the program, similarly there, we see them having bigger increases in employment. One interesting thing in Fort Worth that they've seen is that gap has actually grown over time. And so I think we haven't seen in Rochester what's going to happen quite yet, but I think we're really interested to see, right, in a lot of ways, mobility mentoring and similar programs are a very long-term bet, right? And so it's really important for us to sort of follow what happens beyond that, because you might see these gaps even sort of grow over time. So that sort of leads to what's next. What should you look for in the future with us in Rochester? We're definitely not done there. We have much more to do. There's two more main things that are coming going forward. So we just had a second cohort of people that has enrolled in the evaluation in the first half of this year. And so we're going to, one, be increasing the number of people in the evaluation, which helps us with sort of statistical precision and me making stronger statements about what sort of a difference this might be making. It also puts it in a very different context, obviously. And so I think that'll be something we should learn from as well, of the context of the COVID pandemic. A second piece is that we're also going to be following up with people over a much longer period of time. And so we have the ability through the state of New York's unemployment insurance system to follow people's employment records over a long period of time. And so I think we're really excited to see not just what happened at 12 months, but sort of what happens in the long term, because that really is sort of the bet on these programs that, hey, we're going to do this much more intensive thing. We're going to do something that's a lot more in depth than what people usually do. And the goal then is not just to see differences at 12 months, but to see differences after the program ends and to see sort of permanent change in people's lives. And so we're excited to be able to do the data collection around that now that the sort of study apparatus is set up, and continue following folks and seeing what happens in their lives going forward. So that's what we're up to in Rochester, and I'm looking forward to hear what about Charlie's presentation too. So I'll end it there.
Terrific, David. Thank you so much. Very exciting data. I suspect everybody on this call is as excited as I know we were at EMPath when we first heard your presentation, because it's really it's really the first randomized study that we've seen that really looks at the impact of mobility mentoring or mobility mentoring informed or inspired programs. So very exciting, eager to see what the results continue to see over time. So let me then start and share the presentation I have. And again, this is going to be, I think, a very good complement. You'll see some of the areas where we compromise necessarily on some of the methodologic strengths that David had, but also looking a little more deeply at some of the processes within mobility mentoring. So we're framing this as unpacking mobility mentoring, looking specifically at the roles of goals and meetings. And again, as I said before, I'd like to give special shout out to Tom, who really has undertook most of these analyses and allowed me to do some of the Vanna White role of presenting it. So the question we're asking here, as I said, is what makes mobility mentoring tick? And the real underlying question there is, how do we keep making it more and more effective? As David indicated, as he described the model in Rochester, mobility mentoring has 4 different key components: the bridge to self-sufficiency, the process of coaching itself, goal setting, and issues around approaches to recognition. And the question we're particularly interested in is, how can we best deliver these components to maximize the impact on participant outcomes? As you've heard from Beth Babcock, EMPath's strategic priority over the next several years is learning better through this process of knowledge capture from studies like David's and some of the analyses that we'll be showing here. Our narrower question is around goal setting. So specifically, we asked the question whether the number or the rate or the length of goals affects critical outcomes. And we also had the question of whether the relationship between goals and outcomes is specific to the approach of goal setting, or does it simply reflect the amount of contact between a mentor and a participant? So unlike David's study, we aren't using external comparison groups in this program. We're really looking at variation within EMPath, among our participants, looking at people who had more and less goals and looked at outcomes. And we controlled for a variety of different characteristics, which we'll describe using a couple of statistical techniques. We also separate out our longer-term programs, sometimes called voluntary programs, from our short-term programs, which at EMPath primarily are based in our housing programs, which again last about a year, and those are mandatory in the sense that people come to our programs because they need housing. They're placed in our long-term shelter programs, and because they happen to be placed in our shelter programs, they get mobility mentoring. But it's not as though they signed up to participate in this, unlike our long-term programs where they did have the option of signing up and they chose to do it. The outcomes that we look at, which is very similar to the outcomes that we're looking at in the broader data sharing across the exchange, is exit bridge scores, controlling for entry bridge scores, and exit income, controlling again for entry income. And the exposures that we're interested in is the number of goals that were set. We also look separately at what we're calling long goals or long-term goals, which we define as goals that are in the top quartile by the length that's set at the start. How long, when do you expect to close or complete this goal? And we used it based again on the quartiles. In our long-term programs, those long-term goals are more than 167 days. In our shelter, our housing programs, it's more than 100 days. And we also looked at meetings, and we have reliable counts of meetings only in our long-term programs. So that's the only place that I'll be sharing that data. Our analytic approach, we start with some bivariate analysis, just comparing again these exposures with the outcomes. But then we move into doing some simple linear regression, and then we get a little bit fancy in trying to eliminate extraneous variables by using a process called backwards elimination. We control for a variety of characteristics. As I mentioned, the baseline, income, and bridge. We control for the length of time people are in the program, which in a sense lets us get at this issue of rate. We also control for the year in which the services were delivered. And David actually hinted at the impact of that, because if we're looking at 2020, obviously some weird things have been happening in 2020. And we'll talk to you, we'll show you how that's actually has affected some of our findings. And then we control for a variety of demographic characteristics that if we have time, we can discuss in some of the Q&A. So let's look first at our long-term programs. They're what we call the CFO program. You've heard a lot about that. That's our flagship Career Family Opportunity Program. A similar program is called LEAP, and of course the acronym, what it stands for, runs out of my mind. Maybe Tom will remember it. But it's basically a program for people who were in various public housing programs in the Boston area, and they were offered the opportunity to participate in a CFO-like program at EMPath. And those are the data that we'll be sharing with you. The sample sizes are relatively small. We have 45 from CFO, 47 from LEAP, and we combine the two of them in these analyses. This is simply a graph of our bivariate analyses, and it simply shows that goals, again, in the long-term program, goals set per month are pretty strongly correlated with changes in bridge score, at exit. Changes, so that's exit versus entry. So again, you can see the slope on a graph, the kind of things that you did in grade school or junior high school. You can see statistically the correlation coefficient is 0.49, which is quite strong and it's statistically significant. You can also see that meetings per month really don't have any relationship between changes in bridge scores. So again, it seems to be what actually happens in these meetings rather than simply having a relationship and touching base between a mentor and a participant. Similarly, goals set per month are correlated with a greater change in income. Again, so that's the correlation coefficient is pretty good, 0.34, statistically significant. And the meetings per month similarly not changed. Not related to changes in income. When we got a little bit fancier in looking at our, doing some of our regression analyses, and again, this is the simplified model after our backwards elimination, so it's only those variables that were statistically associated with the exposure and outcome. You see that the number of goals did have a significant, quite highly statistically significant relationship. More goals means better bridge score. Similar results, somewhat higher magnitude with the long goals compared to exit bridge scores. And for income, what we saw was there was a association, particularly between long goals, statistically, between long goals and exit income, controlling for baseline income. The statistical significance of this is what I'd say marginal. It's less than 0.05, but we also did many comparisons, and people who are statistical hard-nosed folks would probably say we needed to use a lower threshold. So I'd call this promising, but I'd call this promising, but not definitive. To move relatively quickly to the housing programs, again, we have a variety of different housing programs at EMPath. Basically, we combine the data from all of them. We don't have reliable meeting data there, so we didn't include those in these particular analyses. I'm sorry, the numbers I have on the bottom of this slide are incorrect. The number should be about 400 in this sample, so it's a much larger sample. And you see that there is an association between long goals set per month and change in bridge score, but you can also see that the power of that association is significantly lower, and the statistical significance, again, is marginal, particularly given that there are multiple comparisons. You can see statistically, when we did some of the more refined analyses, the statistical significance did improve once we controlled for, again, you can see these as a list of a variety of some of the demographic characteristics we looked at. And you can see that in this case, long goals, but also shorter goals, were associated with improved bridge scores. Apropos of David's comment about looking at the timing, we actually did these analyses earlier, sort of towards the end of 2019, and we saw a pretty good association, but the statistical significance was sort of at the margin. We said, well, we'll wait a few months, we'll try to get a bigger sample size, and maybe everything will work out really well. But what we found was actually the relationship between goals and bridge scores changed in 2020. So if you look at the very bottom line here, and again, this is probably taxing your statistical and epidemiologic knowledge, it's certainly taxing mine. There's what we call an interaction term. So between the year in which people exited our program and the number of goals, and you can see actually that if you exited in 2020, the impact of long goals is less than if you exited earlier. So basically there is an association here, but it's modified by when the person exited. We don't know for sure. We simply did it in these analyses by the year 2020, which included 3 months before the onset of the pandemic and 3 months after. So we're not sure whether it's something about the way we focused on goals in 2020 or whether it's actually a pandemic effect. But we do see a less strong relationship in 2020 than we did previously. So just to summarize, and I know this was sort of a once over lightly, but we wanted to leave time for questions. It's pretty clear that more goals are associated with higher bridge scores at exit in all of our programs, controlling for baseline characteristics. We also think that a higher number of long goals predicted higher exit income in long-term programs, although the statistical significance is at the margin. And we also think that long goals has a greater magnitude of impact on bridge score than simply looking at goals overall on bridge scores in any of our programs. And it does seem that meetings per se doesn't really have a relationship to these outcomes. So it's really what happens in these meetings, particularly in this case around goal setting, rather than having contact. So what do we think it means? It's a good question. We do think that this encourages the focus on goal setting, and particularly it leaves the possibility that it's these longer terms, potentially more ambitious goals that really drive improvement. So unlike what we saw in Rochester, again, we did not see a significant relationship between goals and income changes in our housing programs, in our shorter programs. And again, those housing programs are not primarily focused on improving income. While that may be our hope that everyone improves all across the bridge, the people who come into shelter basically want to get permanent housing. They want to get out of shelter as soon as they can. And much as we might encourage them to think about education or other, family stability or other things that'll lead them to long-term self-sufficiency, that may not be well aligned with what their individual goals are. So to me that, we're not saying it's not appropriate in that context, but we are saying income changes might not be the best indicator. Income changes at least in a year in that context. And again, that's our hypotheses. It's something that we surmise based on the data, certainly not a definitive finding. So that's a quick once over of our analyses. I'll stop the share and encourage us, look forward to hearing your questions.
All right, so we already have some questions coming in. You can put the questions in the Whova app if you have access to it. If you can't do that, you can also put it in the Zoom chat as well. We'll see it in both places. So Troy, the first question we have coming in is for us. The question is whether there was any correlation between the kind of goals that were set and outcome, or is it just the straight number of goals, any kind of goal?
It's a great question, and the short answer is we haven't yet looked at that. So we haven't looked, for example, we could look by bridge pillar, things like that. We haven't yet, at least not that I'm aware of. Tom, have we done those analyses that you're aware of?
No, but it's something I really would like to do because, you could imagine employment goals might be more linked to improvements in income, for example. So I think looking at goals by pillar would be really interesting. Cool. And David, we have a question for you coming in as well. The question is asking about the indicators that you looked at for measuring the impact, whether you just focus on employment or whether there were other outcomes that you looked at as well.
Great question. Yeah, so I focused on employment in this presentation. We have people take about an hour-long survey, so we know quite a bit about what they tell us about their lives. It would be hard to summarize all of that quickly, but one thing I'll say is we do related to Charlie's point that like people have different goals. That's part of the one of the fundamental assumptions of programs like this, right? So we do ask people at baseline, what's, here are the areas of the bridge tool. Which of these are you wanting to make the most progress on right now? Just a very quick, one question of that. And then we look to see if people we ask them that at follow-up, we say, hey, a year ago, you told us you wanted to improve on X. How are things going on that? And so we also similarly see some promising signs on that as well, sort of a broader thing. Then we drilled down a lot where we sort of have modules of the survey that align with all the different bridge tools as part of the bridge. I would say that employment is probably the place where we see the most promising results, at least in the short term.
All right, and David, there's another question for you, which is asking about the processes in your program, meetings and goal settings. To what extent is it standardized across participants versus being individualized for each participant?
I'd say, and this is where I'm getting dangerous because I'm really an evaluator of someone else's program, but whereas I know a lot of folks on this call are sort of internal evaluation staff within organizations. But that said, I'd say the processes are quite standardized, but then the actual path for an individual might be quite different depending on what their individual goals are. So yeah, there's the same bridge tool for everybody. There are similar standards for keeping track of goal setting on different time horizons, and there's similar policy for how to attach, when people get monetary compensation for reading a goal. That's so that there's like clear, I think, policies around how this is supposed to around the process, but then there's a lot of variation because different people come in with very different goals. As with any of these programs, that was actually one of the questions I was going to ask for you all, but I'll get in line. But I'm sort of, one thing I'm interested about these programs is there's also a big human element too, right? That there's sort of common policies, but there also might be variation across different staff people in terms of how they implement it. And I think that that's always one of the challenges to think about, like sort of scaling this type of thing.
Yeah, and then so Troy, you mentioned that the CFO and LEAP are voluntary programs, whereas the housing programs are sort of mandatory, that people are in the shelters and are participating in mobility mentoring. There's a question about sort of the differences that you see there and how you think that impacts the experience or outcomes of the participants doing sort of voluntary versus mandatory participation.
Well, I think it's a great question. I mean, I do think, and again, this actually gets to one of the issues that makes a randomized control trial a desirable evaluation strategy. You know, in the programs like CFO, people are motivated. They come in because they've heard from their friends or heard from the communication efforts that we do that say, if you are interested and you'd like to advance in your lives, you know, this is a program that's going to help you get there. So, you know, motivation is critically important in advancing in your life. So I do think that makes a big deal. I mean, again, in housing, I'm not saying, I mean, the people who are in shelter are motivated. There's no question that they're motivated not to be where they are. You know, but whether they have the same longer term aspirations towards economic self-sufficiency, you know, and also, again, particularly in CFO, less so in the LEAP program, which parenthetically stands for Learning, Employment, and Asset Program. Some of my colleagues were kind enough to chat that in. They also had some baseline requirements. They needed to have stable housing, for example. They needed to already have a high school education. So again, those are things that differentiate, you know, that differentiate our programs that are based in our shelters compared with the CFO and to some extent the Mass LEAP program. So I think those are some of the differences. You know, it's a readiness. They're ready to go ahead and take that next step in their lives.
Yeah, Charlie, when you describe the group of participants that participate in CFO, it makes me think of the sort of higher readiness group that David talked about in his 3 groups. And so I'm curious, I guess looking at David's findings for those group and then the things that we've seen when we look at CFO, what does that say to you in that comparison?
I think that's, I mean, that's certainly a question I had as I was looking, you know, at David's data and said, what does that mean? I mean, we did have a little discussion about this. We did have a little bit of a discussion about this at EMPath when I described some of David's data, which was that people who are simply, if you look at this issue, as the statisticians call it, regression to the mean. If you look at people who are furthest away, they're likely to have the greatest income changes just because of the, you know, you caught them at a bad time in their lives and the odds are they're going to have a rebound. Having said that, you know, David did a randomized evaluation. So while both of them showed significant improvements, there were more improvements in the lowest propensity, the group that had the lowest propensity of getting employment. So it's very interesting. I mean, maybe if, you know, maybe if we didn't have those floor requirements for CFO, but still based it on people desiring to have improvements, we'd see similar results to what was seen in Rochester and show greater impact. It's an intriguing possibility. David, what do you think on that? Do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I think I mean, it is an interesting question. It is worth mentioning that in the program in Rochester, it's still a self-selected group of people, not so like, right, the program group and the comparison group are comparable to each other, right? So we're not sort of picking up something that we're not supposed to, but everybody who's in the comparison group and everybody in the program is somebody who said, yeah, I want to sign up for this thing, right? And so that's, it is, what is the effect of this program for a group of people who volunteered for it? Which, I mean, which, you know, most people in the neighborhoods that were eligible for this program didn't show up and say they want to do it, right? It's a selected group of people, right? So I think that actually for me is one of, as we're seeing more and more positive evidence from multiple different evaluations of mobility mentoring type programs, I think one question we've been kicking around a lot at our lab is, okay, so why is it the case when these programs are voluntary that most people say no, if they have these benefits? Is it because people are unaware of them, right? You might imagine from like the brain science point of view, right? That's just the long term is just so far off, and the immediate is I've got to find a stable place to live or whatever it is, that like it's just hard to show up to this thing, even if it's really beneficial in the long term. Or it could, I mean, the alternative view is that there's a group of people who benefit and there's another group of people who don't. And so I think getting at that about why is it that people show up or don't show up actually is going to be a key thing for understanding what we're learning from our evaluations. Because we definitely see evidence in ours that people show up for a reason. We see, for instance, earnings dip. We can follow people's earnings sort of in the time before they show up and when they come and afterwards. And we can do that for the control group. And you can see, even for the comparison group who's not getting the program, there's this big fall off and rebound for that group, which suggests like they showed up because they lost a job or something wrong with something bad happened, right? That's why they came to the door in the first place.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And so sort of following up on this idea of changes over time, there's another question about the outcomes after exit. And so I know, David, you talked about that there's the possibility that you might be able to use the unemployment records to see what happens to participants after their participation in the program. I'm curious if you have any like hypotheses or expectations about what you might see when you look at that data.
I mean, I think we're encouraged by, yeah, so you're correct that so the agreements we have in place right now allow us to follow people for 5 years after they started the study. So we're really I think that'll be the proof in the pudding, right? So whatever the data says. But I think in terms of hypotheses, things I'm interested in testing, one is I think from the experience in Fort Worth where they're a little bit ahead of us, I think I'm interested to see whether this sort of gap continues to open up. And then it's a 2-year program. So I think year 3 is going to be a key year, right? To see, does that improvement in outcomes, does it persist as people leave the program and they're doing things without the support of the program, or does it fall off? That's going to be a little bit complicated by the fact that year 3 coincides with COVID for our first cohort. So I think it'll be useful that we have these 2 cohorts eventually, one from a couple of years ago and one that has just come in now, who will exit the program, hopefully into, knock on wood, into a better world than we're in right now. But yeah, I think I think what happens in year 3, 4, 5 after years 1 and 2, I think that's one really key thing we want to look at, because I think if you look, that's really the argument for this type of program, right? Is that benefit's going to continue, that you can take away the program after a couple of years and it stays around.
Yeah, absolutely. And Charlie, I know we have some data from our alumni survey of CFOs. Do you want to talk about that a little bit, what we've seen after the program ends for CFO?
Sure. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned it. I was thinking the same thing during your question. So we do survey the alumni of the CFO program and ask them, so it's self-reported, we do ask them questions that get at persistence for bridge scores, I think, Tom, isn't it? And also income. And basically we see that they do maintain, for a number of years after graduation. There seems to be a fairly level, fairly consistent level. I think there was a tiny drop off like 3 or 4 years afterwards, but really by and large, it's been quite persistent. So we're very encouraged by that.
Cool, great. So that's all the questions that were submitted, and we're at 2:45. So that's perfect timing. Do you have any final words that you want to leave us with?
I certainly want to thank people for participating. It's great. We're eager to have all of you participate in our ongoing efforts to learn from our work. So the data sharing efforts, and also very excited about these opportunities for randomized controlled trials to really do some large scale testing. And I think we'll be seeing more of that over the next several years. So thank you very much. It's great. It's great to have so many people from the exchange participating. Thank you, David. Good.